Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Preparing for USMCA Day. This is episode 2 in our series, USMCA Customs Compliance and Automotive Rules of Origin. My name is Christine Kloka. Before we begin, I want to cover a few quick housekeeping items. At the bottom of your console screen, there are several buttons. We call them application widgets. If you have a question during the webcast, please click on that Q&A widget and submit your question. We're going to answer questions in real time during the program today. So if you have a question, don't wait. Type it in that Q&A widget now. We've included the presentation slide deck in the handouts widget. It has an upward pointing black arrow. The biographies and contact information for all of our speakers can be found in the speaker biography widget. We've also added a contact us widget so you can sign up for the next episode, episode 3 in our series, coming up in 2 weeks on Thursday, March 28th. You'll also see the COVID-19 response widget, which easily connects you to the World Health Organization Solidarity Response Fund. We're all in this together. A recorded on-demand version of the webcast will be available tomorrow, and you will be sent an email with that link. I'm really pleased to introduce our chair, Dan Utso of our International and Canada Regional Practice. Dan specializes in cross-border Canada-United States matters, and in addition to his legal practice, Dan has responsibility for coordinating the firm's innovative Canada-U.S. platform. We have a lot to get through, so I'm going to turn it over to Dan. Take it away, Dan.
Great. Thanks, Christine, and thanks for kicking us off and for all your assistance with this Preparing for USMCA, CUSMA, T-MEC Day series. We have so many long-standing friends on the call today. Many of you after episode 1 sent nice little notes, and those are appreciated, not necessary. The best compliment we get is keep coming back. And we also have a number of new friends. Welcome and for joining us. I did just want to emphasize something Christine said, or two things. Number one, that these are on demand. You can watch these later. We know we're going to put a lot of information at you, particularly today, but that's because we know you can go back and say, what did she say? What did he say? And secondly, if you got questions, fire them into the chat now because we're going to be answering those in real time. There won't be a big bucket at the end for questions, but against that backdrop, on behalf of our firm, Dickinson, Wright, and all of our partner organizations, our speakers, and I certainly extend my own personal sentiments. Thank you for joining us. We wish you the very best in terms of your physical health, your prosperity, and your patience. I've noticed in our COVID-19 resource that we have at Dickinson, Wright, which I commend to any of you, I've started to notice our family law practice. Our divorce attorneys are starting to write a lot of the articles about managing your managing being at home with your spouse, domestic partner in month 2. So we all know that times are trying right now in a lot of ways, but we'll hope that we'll keep pressing forward and wish you the best in that regard. Now, our goal today and for this series is to create a one-stop shop. That's what I said in episode 1, but USCBP on their USMCA call said that their center is a one-stop shop, their new USMCA Center of Excellence. So let me put this in the language of the day that this webinar series is designed to be your essential business. This is your grocery store, your pharmacy trip during these times between now and the July 1st implementation date. There certainly are other resources out there, including, many of you are probably coming over from this USCBP call, U.S. Commercial Service, the Canadian government, the Mexican government, many trade associations. But our goal was to bring together a diverse group of sectors and practice areas to give you the foundational elements between now and July 1st to ensure that you're ready when we go and spring into action. And you know, as I said before, North America is part of Dickinson Wright's DNA. You can even see that image in front of you is a picture of our Detroit, Windsor office, and as well as our El Paso, Juarez offices, and you know, border to border and coast to coast is what we're doing. But we can't do that alone. We have a number of great organizations that have partnered with us. And suffice it to summarize, all of these groups were doing North America, NAFTA, and now USMCA before it was cool. Great deal of experience and expertise, and thank all of them for shaping this program. We're great members of all of these groups. But as are many of you, and we just can't say enough about their assistance, and thank you all. The lineups for our series, today we're going to talk about before the border issues, specifically chapters 4 and a little bit of 5 in USMCA, which is how do you prepare to get your goods ready to go and for that staging at the border. In 2 weeks, as Christine mentioned, on May 28th, we're going to look at the border issues. So we're going to hear from the Consul General of Canada in Detroit, Windsor. We're going to hear from the Mayor of Laredo, Nuevo Laredo. We'll have a customs broker as well talking about customs processing, some of the issues going on in supply chain management. And then we're going to talk about moving people, the immigration aspects. We'll follow that with what border, and that's often what we hear from our technology and intellectual property issues. As I talked about at the episode 1, that all companies will be impacted by the IP and digital changes, so that's an important session in mid-June. And then 2 weeks later, we'll talk about behind-the-border issues at regulatory, competitiveness, small and medium-sized enterprises. That's where a lot of the gems in USMCA can be found. And then we'll conclude on July 9th. We've scheduled a session after the implementation date, both A, to talk about the environment, and B, to talk about what comes next. And I think if there's any takeaway from our comments is that USMCA is not going to be the NAFTA. This is a living agreement. There are at least 26 up to 34 working groups and interagency committees to implement this agreement and to keep it alive over time. And that is something very different from the NAFTA, and as those ramp up, that's going to be important to take place. For today's session, we have a talented group of speakers. I can't say enough about this crew. We're going to start with Tiffany Melvin, the President and CEO of NASCO. I commend you to her bio. Suffice it to summarize, anything going on in North America, Tiffany knows about or knows how to get there. She's one of the best connectors around. I can't just say enough about the work that she does, and an even better friend. We'll follow that with comments by Sergio Villalora, who's come back for episode 2 of ICOM and the Business Coordinating Council of Mexico. Sergio's doing double duty for us today. He's just going to follow up on what's going on with Mexico's reopening as a follow-up from episode 1. There's been some changes in the last, I was going to say 24 hours, but actually in about the last 12 hours. That changed the 24 hours. So Sergio's going to bring us up to speed there. We'll then hear from Adam Hill at Scarbrough International, one of the leading customs brokers in North America. Adam's back in Kansas City, but does work in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And beyond his in-depth knowledge and mastery of NAFTA and USMCA, is one of the most responsive customs brokers I've ever come around, which is just critical for our shared clients. Then we'll hear from the Dean of our International Law Practice at Dickinson, Wright, Bruce Thelen. Again, unrivaled in his international experience, particularly as a member of the Michigan DEC, the German-American Chamber, the British-American Chamber, et cetera, et cetera. Bruce and I are going to, in the middle, give some very specific examples as illustrations of how USMCA works, kind of get it out of some of the clouds and bring it down to a very practical level along with Adam. And then at halftime leading into the third quarter, we're going to talk about a very specific area, which is the automotive rules of origin. Eric Miller of Rideau, Potomac will be with us and tee us up. Eric, as many of you know, spent a significant amount of time in the Canadian government, particularly working with the auto sector on the bailout and other types of issues, or I'm sorry, on the support, not bailout. But Eric has a consulting firm that works around the world with managing supply and value chain, particularly in Asia and Vietnam in particular. And we welcome Eric today. And then we will have Sergio come back and talk to us there. But Sergio's brought along one of ICOM's strategic advisors for the automotive rules of origin, somebody that knows this probably better than anybody on the planet, Moises Zavaleta, who was Mexico's negotiator during USMCA for the auto rules of origin. And we're privileged to have Moises with us in his body of expertise that goes not only with USMCA, but Mexico's agreements with the European Union, CPTPP, and many, many others. And we welcome Moises to be with us today. So it's action-packed. We're right on time. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tiffany Melvin to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Dan. Dickinson Wright is a long-standing member of NASCO, and Dan serves on our board of directors, and he is certainly our go-to expert on USMCA. I very much appreciate his sweet introduction, but we feel the same way about Dan, and we're so excited to help support and promote these webinars. super timely and informative, and when I heard about them, I thought it was an amazing idea, and I appreciate you very much giving me a few minutes to discuss our new emergency supply chain focus, our North American emergency supply chain focus, because I know I'm not the real show today, so I'm not going to take too much of your time, but I'm hoping to share a little bit of info about it because maybe some of you listening on the phone today are able to help. So just first, a little bit of background on NASCO. For those of you that are unfamiliar with NASCO, we're a trinational membership organization focused on the competitiveness of North American supply chains, the environment, and skilled workforce. Our members come from all over Canada, the United States, and Mexico. We have all modes of transportation represented in our membership. We've got water ports, inland ports, real estate, finance, insurance, banking, industry, from global corporations on down to very, very small businesses. We have local governments, state and provincial governments, universities, community colleges, high school independent school districts, trade associations, chambers, economic development organizations. I mean, it goes on and on. We have a very vast, diverse network of members, and they all bring different perspectives to the table. We also have a lot of, really good, close working relationships with many of the federal government agencies from all the 3 countries. And our main focus areas are sort of shown on this page. It's supply chain and logistics and the environmental issues related to them, and closing the skilled workforce gaps throughout our continent, mostly focusing on manufacturing and logistics jobs. And you can see the detail of our initiatives. I'm not going to go through it all right now. I would love to, but our connections, but I don't have time right now, but our connections and our network have the knowledge and expertise, and they engage with us on all of these different efforts. So we do advocacy and we take action. And our very newest North American initiative is our Emergency Supply Chain Continuity Initiative, and it is rather obviously based on recent events. The foundation of NASCO is that our members love North America. It sounds kind of cheesy, but it's true. And we see the opportunity we have as North Americans to have our continent be the most competitive on Earth. And we already see the deep integration of our supply chains and our livelihoods and our climate and our families. And now, of course, with the COVID-19, we see the way the pandemic has affected all of us. It doesn't respect international boundaries. And so we are hoping to be able to use the power of our network to help now and for the long term with future natural disasters or, heaven forbid, another pandemic. You've seen, I think, in recent weeks that we've got this jurisdictional patchwork of different strategies and implementation plans and stay-at-home orders and then reopening efforts to fight the pandemic across our cities, our states, our provinces, our continent, but they're disjointed, they're not working together, and it's not had a positive result. And so then you add to that the competition for the supplies that are out there, the scarce supplies. It's been chaotic, it's been negligent, and quite frankly, it's killing people. And so this unified approach we think is vital, and we need to have the North American stakeholders solidly in place to be able to surge production and reduce lead time on a moment's notice. Can't be caught off guard again, and unfortunately, in some cases, we can't rely on the overseas markets to deliver, the life-saving products, these time-sensitive products, in a fair and equitable and timely way. And some of the markets are not exactly our friends, and so we believe very strongly at NASCO that we've got to keep this in our North American family. We've already got this diverse network that I've mentioned. It's taken 26 years to build. It's effective. Our members are engaged, and each of our members has their own network of contacts. And so we feel like we have an opportunity to harness a lot of the energy and action, and we hope we can make a really big difference and literally, help save lives. So the model, in our opinion, has to have it all. We've got to know where the raw materials are. We have to have the component parts, the finished products, the warehousing, where it's going to be stored, the delivery and logistics providers, and the service providers. And we've got to have the coordination at all levels of government and industry and internationally. We have to have North American regulatory compatibility, especially with the medical devices and the supplies, PPEs. What's good enough for Canadian and Mexican doctors should be good enough for the U.S. doctors and vice versa. So we've got to work on the regulatory compatibility. We need to have common sense definitions of, of essential businesses, not just supply chain, but the services that support the supply chain, which I think we have had some issues with this round. Truck stops, for example, we've heard stories of, truck drivers from Canada coming across the border to the U.S. and having no place to sleep or shower because the truck stops were closed. They weren't deemed essential at first. And so we've got to have, common definitions of the essential businesses. We need to be sensitive to what stage of the virus each of the countries are in. So this is it's a bold vision. It's a lot of hard work. We're certainly not the only ones interested in doing it. But we're hoping that, by putting this out there, and I kind of did to our membership about a month ago, we've had an overwhelming response, and we've already made a lot of new contacts and a lot of new partnerships, and we're amassing a great set of stakeholders. And one of the most important discoveries that we had was the American Logistics Aid Network. And I found out about these guys about 3.5 weeks ago. We became fast friends, been working together, and I've been so impressed. And I try to, in every one of my presentations or phone calls, talk about these guys because I think everyone should know where they are. American Logistics Aid Network, it's ALAN, A-L-A-N, aid, A-I-D.org. They've been around about 15 years. They were formed after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, and they have assembled logistics providers and warehousing facilities from across the USA to be able to literally spring into action during emergencies. And so we want to help expand that network into Mexico and Canada as well, and also help, of course, get new blood into the organization from the U.S. It's a great partnership. We've already been able to help one another during this pandemic. We helped get a temporary clinic across the southern border, but you can see from the previous slides that they're partners and the depth and reach they have and who they've helped. It's pretty impressive. And so we want to work with all of you. We would love for you to send any contacts and ideas you have for the North American Emergency Supply Chain Continuity Initiative. Our contact info is on the next page. And again, I appreciate so much the time to speak with you. And I know that you are not here for me, but please, if you can't help, that would be great. And we'd love to hear from you. So thanks very much, Dan, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thanks, Tiffany. And we know a number of companies on the line are having issues with PPE, getting other types of products across the border. The key takeaway is that NASCO is coordinating so many of those efforts in all of those areas, from logistics, from warehousing, and if you're running into problems, reach out to us. We'll get you in touch with NASCO or them, and it's just a critical issue. Now over to Sergio. Sergio, can you just give us a very quick update on what's going on in Mexico overnight with the ports of entry, and then we'll quickly turn it over to Adam to take a deeper dive into USMCA.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Dan, for the invitation to be here with you again. And good afternoon to everybody. Congratulations, Tiffany, for the great work that NASCO is doing. So we have an important announcement yesterday and this morning regarding specifically the opening of 3 sectors that in Mexico are not defined or were not defined as essential. One is the transportation sector, which includes automotive and aeronautic sectors. The other one is mining, and the third one is construction. So we have had all these discussions. We talk about this the other webinar. Dan, the supply chain, U.S. automakers have requested that the supply chain of auto parts in Mexico starts 5 days before they do. There was a lot of discussion of starting this week. Yesterday, the Minister of the Economy, in a conference with the presence of the President of Mexico, announced that May 18th would be the date for the auto industry to go back to production in Mexico, obviously including auto parts and the whole supply chain. That changed this morning, and this morning there was an official gazette, a Mexican official gazette, indicated that the date would be June 1st. So as of June 1st, the construction, transportation, and mining sectors would be considered essential and would be able to go back into full operation. Prior to that, there are health protocols that have been developed for them that are to be published in the following days. There is still a lot of discussions in Mexico. This is moving, unfortunately, every minute, as you explained. So there is still some discussion of giving the opportunity to some of the auto supply chain to start operating at least partially in the following weeks prior to June 1st. But as we are today, what is official right now is June 1st is the date for the auto industry in Mexico to go back to full operation.
Great. Thank you, Sergio. Thank you. And that's the advantage of doing this as a series. Every week we're going to open up with some of these real-time updates given the environment in which we're in. Additionally, many, as I said at the outset, of us just got off the U.S. CBP call on USMCA, which was a great call. U.S. CBP is doing great outreach, as are our friends in Mexico and Canada. But with that, so we have some real-time information. I'll turn it over to you, Adam, and give us the broker's perspective as to what's different in USMCA from what we're already doing in NAFTA. And I can tell you, both on the US CBP call on our first episode and already today, most of the questions are on the certificate of origin, and we are going to cover that. So stay tuned if I think we got a ton of questions on that. Yes, it's coming right now. So over to you, Adam.
Perfect. Thanks, Dan. Like Dan said, my name's Adam Hill. I'm the President and Chief Operating Officer of Scarbrough International. We're an international freight forwarder and customs broker. So we're going to get in a little bit to what we see as some changes coming up at the border in general. So you have de minimis and low value entry. We have some updates on transshipment. There's an SPI change, which I'll explain here shortly. Some interesting stuff with unconditionally duty-free items and MPF. Then the certification requirement, not the form requirement, and then record keeping, which I actually think is kind of also just an interesting piece as we get a little bit deeper into what this looks like as an importer just in general. So first off, we have low value entry. So some stuff that's coming in that here in the U.S. we might refer to as that Section 321, which is that $800. Canada and Mexico did raise their amounts. So Canada up to $150, up to 150 Canadian dollars, Mexico 117 US. But you'll notice on both Canada and Mexico, there's a different set amount for GST, or in Mexico, what we would call IVA. So just a quick heads up there that while we do have some duty-free options and we've raised the amount in both Canada and Mexico, there is some additional tax penalty for some of those lower value items. From a de minimis perspective, we have anything that is non-originating at 10% or less, means at that point that you can kind of exclude that from your calculation, and your goods should at that point be able to qualify as long as less than 10% of the costs are non-originating materials. Now, there is a little bit of difference in chapters 1 through 27, which you get a little bit into from live animals and the food and some other things like that. And then textiles and apparel also have different de minimis rules. So as we get going into the transshipment piece of this, there's some interesting things, and you wouldn't think this happens, but we've all seen some rather complex supply chains where we see product just like we see here in North America, with the automobile sometimes moving across the border 7 to 8 times. There are times when transshipment in this scenario is going to be allowed. There are a few catches here. We need to make sure that cargo does remain under control of the customs territory of a non-party. So non-party would be anyone that's not the Canada, US, or Mexico. There is a lot that's actually allowed inside of that, but obviously it has to be done under customs control. So here in the US, you're talking about potential manipulation. So that kind of work being done in a non-party country. So there is something here that's a benefit if your supply chain takes advantage or needs to take advantage of some of this stuff. But really the first catch here is just make sure that your goods have stayed in the customs control of a non-party, and then the rest of it will just kind of flow from there. There is a special program indicator change currently for those of you who look in the tariff. You'll see CA and MX as options for the current NAFTA agreement. USMCA will supplement that with just the letter S. So that, as Dan said, we were just on a CBP call that started about an hour and a half ago, and there's a lot that's going to go into this that maybe we don't realize from a programming perspective. So we have reconciliation entries, drawback entries, as we start to look at potential 520D claims and some of the things that we transmit electronically to customs, where previously we had CA and we had MX as the special program indicator to indicate that your item should be both duty-free and free of merchandise processing fees. But now that's getting changed to S. So just be wary that if any of you are looking in ACE at your reporting, you're going to see a change there, and know that there's probably going to be some early hiccups with customs as far as how this looks when us as a broker starts to transmit this data across. So that's just kind of a quick heads up. For merchandise processing fee, obviously for any goods that are originating, that's a win. You already get to reduce your tax liability there. But a couple of things to note here is make sure that if your item is already duty-free, which you kind of see free in the HTS-US duty rate column 1, that no SPI of S, which is the new USMCA SPI, will be listed, but you do have the ability to claim it. Now, obviously, merchandise processing fee does max out. However, there could be some amount of savings depending on your shipping patterns and your values. One note here, though, is if you are going to use these unconditionally duty-free claims, make sure that the same certification and verification requirements exist for your dutiable goods. We always like to tell folks that you want to make sure that saving that $14 a year is actually worth the compliance risk of doing that in general. So certificate of origin, right? I think that's where, as Dan said, that's where most of the questions came. So really there's 9 data elements that exist here. So one of the big changes, besides the fact that there's no form or no official form, is that they're also allowing for an importer certification, not just an exporter or a producer. So the first thing that you're going to list on probably an Excel spreadsheet is whether this is an importer, an exporter, or a producer certificate of origin. So step 1. Step 2, who's actually certifying this? Name, title, address, including country, phone, and email. Number 3, who's the exporter? Name, address, including country. You're going to notice some themes as we go through a lot of this. It's not required. You're not required to list the exporter if the producer, and if it's completed by the producer and the exporter is actually unknown. And then the address will be the place of export in a good in the party's territory. So as we move on to the next elements here, which we're going to have with producer, name, address, once again, including country. You only need to provide if the producer is different from the certifier or the exporter. Now, this is where some of that old NAFTA form language maybe starts to come into play a little bit. One is, if there's multiple producers, you're still allowed to state various. In addition, if you want to maintain some confidentiality of your supply chain as a whole, you are allowed to put available upon request by the importing authority. So I just want to make note on those 2 things as far as the producer goes. Then you have obviously the importer, name, address, including country again. And so what we kind of anticipate as we kind of get into this next chunk, which when you look at items 6, 7, and 8, especially 6 and 7, to me, these line up in a spreadsheet very nicely, right? Hopefully most of you have some form of a system that you can pull this data out of and start to get your head wrapped around what does this look like. The description is at the 6-digit level. Make sure we actually use the 6-digit tariff level. Description should be sufficient to relate it to the good covered by the certification itself. There's a lot of conversation in this piece on whether or not you should actually list part numbers here. I kind of have a mixed feeling on that. You could list part number, which is very simple then for that part number. For as if you provide that data to customs at some point, that's very simple to say part number 123 was filed on this customs entry. This customs entry had part number 123. We claim the SPI of S for USMCA, and as you can see, here is where I certified that part. Now, obviously, if you bring a new part in, that part number may not be on there. So, good descriptions, quality descriptions of your items are key. And then part number really starts to get dependent on your level of risk as far as potentially bringing in new parts that weren't listed on the original certificate. The origin criteria, we still have that same origin criteria as we had in the past, whether they were wholly produced in a country, whether we're taking into account some regional value content calculation, or obviously as we get into the automotive side, some net cost calculations. Assuming you're going to issue a blanket statement, which would be good for a year, you obviously need that much. At the bottom of this, you do have to still sign and date this, and there's a very specific statement that needs to be on here. You certify the goods that are described in this document. It's actually very, very similar to the prior form. So speaking to the form just in general, there was a question on the previous CBP call that was just brought up that said, and I think we've even seen some stuff come in the Q&A about this, is it says, does my current NAFTA cert work as of 7/1, right? 7/1's that magic day when we, in theory, flip the switch. The answer from CBP was a very hard and fast no. That document no longer satisfies the requirement. However, if you look at the 9 elements I just gave you, you pull up a NAFTA, your current NAFTA form, you're going to start to see a lot of similarities that work their way through this. So because of that, you should be able to take the data that you currently have residing in a NAFTA form or in some kind of attachment where you potentially list out your thousands of parts, that you will be able to take and recreate this certificate relatively quickly from what you already have. Now, I caution everybody, and I think we'll get into this a little bit later, but I really do caution everybody that just because it qualified for NAFTA doesn't necessarily mean it's going to qualify for USMCA, and you're going to see that throughout the rest of this presentation, that there are certainly some changes as they start to come in. So, like I said, there is no set form for the certificate. We would anticipate that a spreadsheet would be provided as a broker. That would make life simpler for us rather than reading through your 10-page PDF certificate of origin to get information provided in the spreadsheet that allows us to pull data into our system to kind of help you as an importer work through all of these new USMCA claims. Another question was obviously, can we use the NAFTA cert? Once again, the answer to that question is no. The data should be good, but just providing that NAFTA cert as of 7/1 is not going to be valid. If customs were to ask for it after 7/1 and you say, here's my NAFTA cert for an entry that crossed after a 7/1 or after, they're not going to accept that form as your certification. You're going to have to go through these 9 items. So the last piece to hit on here is some of the record keeping requirements. So if you're the importer here in the U.S., we have 5 years from date of entry for retention of records and supporting documentation related to the importation. Right, this is the same documentation that CBP requires any importer to keep. Then as a certifier, also 5 years, we have all records from, we have all records and supporting documents related to the purchase cost value of shipping and payment. We have the purchase cost value of shipping and payment of all materials, and the production of the good in the form in which the exporter, or the production of the material in the form in which it was sold. So even now the certifier has some additional record keeping requirements on top of just what was previously in NAFTA, and even on top of, so the importer has documentation to keep, the certifier has documentation to keep, and as you'll see on the next slide, there's also a few, for the vehicle producers in general, there are some additional things to take into account, specifically the labor value content and your steel and aluminum purchasing requirements. So both of those things are going to be relatively important for these vehicle producers, because if you are the importer, you're still keeping all this importer data. If you're certifying, you're keeping all the certifier data. But then in addition to that, as we get farther into the auto rules of origin, you're going to start to see some of these labor value content items and steel and aluminum purchasing requirements work their way into this conversation. The next one, there we go. So as the certificates start to come in, right, we just had this conversation, is what's in NAFTA may not be USMCA duty-free. And so I think that's probably one of the biggest catches in here, is making sure, I think a lot of you have said we've spent a lot of time, money, and energy qualifying our goods for NAFTA. And I hate to say it, but in a lot of instances, we're going to have to start over. So that should make your attorneys and outside counsel happy, simply because that's probably a lot more work for them. Those of you who do it in-house, I'm sorry, there's going to be a big chunk of work that comes from this, and it's something that we're all going to work through together.
Great, thanks, Adam. And yeah, no, that's perfect timing. Just as a side note on a technical side, I know some of you got stuck on slide 12. Refresh your browser. Also, Chrome and Firefox work best, but it's also because I think a lot of us are on home networks as well. Just building off of some of the things Adam said, and based on some of the questions, and I quickly want to turn to Bruce on the examples here. But just, it's critical to remember what a certificate of origin is for. It's for verification purposes. And I think over time, we just all became so reliant on it, either as a ticket to get into the country duty-free, or a get-out-of-jail-free card if you were ever subject to a verification, right? The whole purpose is to ensure that those products are what they say they are. And so the first step for your preparation for USMCA is recognize that there's no golden ticket anymore. You have to know those data elements, most of which are on your NAFTA certificate of origin, but also to make sure that you're using this time between now and July 1st to actually verify your suppliers. If you're comfortable with your supplier and their suppliers and adopting that mindset, then you're in good shape. But if you have just been asking your supply chain, give us a certificate of origin, having no idea what's there, that's what the change is. The benefit of more flexibility and not having a prescribed form is in exchange for companies doing the record keeping and verifications themselves. And Adam is talking about Excel spreadsheets. This is the time right now to go out there and verify your suppliers, because we all know how it's worked for many of us in the past, which is, hey, I need a certificate of origin, I'm going to ask somebody down the chain for it, and they give you one and you don't know what it is. You have to know what's in it. It's not just about using a form or crossing off NAFTA on your certificate of origin in USMCA. That preparation between now and July 1 is what it's all about, is to really get into your supply chain and understand. And when we talked on episode 1, that's the preparation piece. Now, one issue that I do want to raise is, forget the heading here, the interim rules that, instructions that USCBP put out so that there would be no NAFTA marking rules as most of us in the customs world have to apply, although it looks like those are going to be enforced for a while, at least for country of origin marking, maybe not for determining rules of origin. So all of those traditional marking rules are still in force. But as we'll see in a few examples, one thing that all of you need to remember is that as we kind of cut the chase as to what is substantial transformation, there have been almost 700 customs rulings since 2018 in what is substantial transformation, largely driven by the tariff levels, the China tariffs. So one of the things that you have to do is what may have been substantial transformation, what may have counted for NAFTA in the past, may not under these new rulings count for USMCA. So if you're relying on old binding rulings or advanced rulings from CBSA, you got to go back and check those in light of recent decisions. So this is the time from May to July 1st to really make sure what you're moving in North America is still duty-free, and that's part of what this preparation is all about. I just note before turning it over to Bruce, just some quick updates from the last hour. US CBP does plan to make those interim instructions final by July 15th, and we are expecting the Department of Labor rules by June 30th on things like labor value content. So we'll know a little bit more there, and the uniform regs should be out by July 1st, although I think both countries will try to get those out a little bit in advance as well. Now, as you go through certain aspects of USMCA, just to show you how this works in practice, there's actually a lot of good news. I know certificate of origin may seem a little frustrating, some of this general customs compliance, but it's actually an important time to get ready. But there's a lot of good news in here. And so when you look at something like moving chemicals, polymers, et cetera, the old Chapter 8, 28s to 32s, we've gotten rid of many of the complicated rules there and added, for example, 8 new tests. That gives a lot of flexibility to companies, and as I mentioned in episode 1, we found one company, this would save $17 million. Just changing the one line in USMCA is saving $17 million a year. So for that sector in particular, so I think as you may say, well, this is all about compliance. This is also about opportunity. If you go line by line, what you're going to see is there's a lot of good news in USMCA. And I'll now turn it over to Bruce to look at a couple of areas as illustrative of some of these changes. So over to you, Bruce, to fill us in on some petroleum, textiles, and a couple of others.
Okay, great, Dan, thanks. Yeah, we're going to run through this real quickly, but we'll take petroleum first. I think we all know, even if we're not oil traders, that the price of petroleum is, every time we look at the gas pump, is a very volatile thing. But we saw something that was very unusual on April 20th when the price of the West Texas Intermediate benchmark crude fell below zero. How can that happen? Well, you know, it's a unusual future transaction in that it is settled in physical delivery of the product. So you actually had traders who didn't have storage, and if you didn't have storage, you had to pay somebody to take it off your hands. But we've got a big petroleum sector in North America. Nobody ever would have imagined that back in 1994 when NAFTA came into force. But the U.S. Since then has become an exporter of petroleum products after a 40-year export ban was lifted in 2015. Mexico has massive reserves, and by the way, the new Chapter 8 recognizes the government of Mexico's ownership of hydrocarbons in the country. Canada's upstream industry is said to be the largest private investor. It's a huge source of export revenue for Canada. And the Alberta oil sands, I was very surprised when I first heard this, that it's one of the largest oil reserves in the world, really ranking generally after Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. So what's changed in rules of origin? As Dan was saying, there's some good news. Under the NAFTA rules for petroleum products under Chapter 27, there were some things that were based on what's called the chemical reaction rule. If the product resulted from a chemical reaction, it was deemed to be originating if that transaction and the reaction actually happened in a NAFTA country. That rule's been extended now so that it applies to everything under Chapter 27. So that's going to be a big plus in the upgrading and refining of petroleum products where you have these kind of reactions. It's going to simplify determining origination much more readily than it has been in the past. What else has changed? Well, there have been some rulings by CBP that have created some difficulties. One in natural gas, where some Canadian natural gas was found to be non-qualifying, simply because of a theoretical notion of customs that, well, we could have had some liquefied natural gas that came into a port in the United States. It could have been gasified, turned into a gaseous state, put on a pipeline and transferred north and commingled with Canadian pipeline gas. and thereby tainting everything that was in that Canadian pipeline. It's a very difficult thing to kind of prove a negative for an importer of natural gas in those circumstances. But the new rules have fixed that. Any time that there is a conversion of liquefied natural gas to gaseous gas, it is now going to be treated as a qualifying originating product. So that's very helpful. Take one other item lastly, and this one has some real significance. Heavy crude oil under section heading 2709 is produced from bituminous materials like those that you find in the Canadian oil sands. But it's so thick and heavy that it has to be thinned with a lighter grade product in order to be transported on a pipeline system. So that lighter grade product is referred to as diluent. Now the problem with diluent is that it's often drawn from pools where it's collected into storage tanks and it's drawn out by those who need it. But the inputs really don't come in with NAFTA origin certificates. So it's a real problem, and it generally negates the NAFTA qualification for the crude and diluent blend when it's drawn out in those circumstances. That problem has been fixed. I mean, it's been fixed, and there's just less of an issue nowadays with diluent because it's more available. In some cases, it's been pipelined up from the United States into Canada. Some of those pipelines actually have NAFTA, implicit NAFTA deemed certifications, so that anyone injecting product into the pipeline is deemed to have certified that it is NAFTA qualifying. But the new rules under USMCA are going to disregard diluent that's used for transport if it's no more than 40% of the blend's total volume. So that's a big plus. It's a big headache that's been removed in the course of the USMCA change. So let's go take another look at another sector, textiles and textile apparel. You may think differently about what you're wearing after we finish this little discussion, but let's take a look first at the steps in production. First, if it's cotton or wool, it's actually grown and it has to then be formed into a fiber. If it's a man-made material, it has to be extruded and formed into a fiber. The next step would be to take those fibers, spin it or twist it into a yarn. The yarns are then woven or knitted into fabrics, and then finally the fabrics are cut and sewn to make the garments and the textile articles that we actually go to the store and buy. So the rules of origin for textiles and apparel generally follow that, that production process. So these are really shorthand, abbreviated terms for the rules of origin, but they're generally reflected if you look at the textile and apparel articles in the rules of origin. You'll see these reflected. So fiber forward, that rule would require that an article's fiber be formed and that all the later processes before the product crosses a border in North America must occur in a USMCA country. Yarn forward, similar idea. The yarn forward must be, and all the later processes have to occur in a USMCA country. Fabric forward, same idea. For any product subject to a fabric forward rule, it's going to have to be formed and the later processes occur in a USMCA country. And then finally, cut and sewn is just, okay, if you cut it and sew it in a USMCA country, that's going to be sufficient for purposes of origination. But there's lots of twists and turns and exceptions along the way. First, in the sense of just the fact of apparel being what it is. It's made up of all kinds of stuff. It's shells, it's linings, it's pockets, it's baubles, it's snaps, it's zippers, it's thread, a whole variety of things that go into the stuff that we're wearing. Look at what you have on right now, and you'll see all of those things reflected there. Now, the tariff shift rules for textiles and apparel generally apply only to the component that determines the tariff classification. So that simplifies it a bit. And generally, the clothing we have on now follows what would be called a yarn forward rule, meaning that, everything from the yarn on has to be produced in a NAFTA or a USMCA country to be qualifying. Another shift, though, that has made things much better, considering all the little things that go into a piece of apparel and into the fabric. If you have a fabric blend, you may have a North American cotton, for example, or a wool. But if it's blended with something else, that something else conceivably could come from outside the region and create a problem. Under the de minimis rules, the former 7% threshold is now increased up to 10%. But here it's not value, it's based on total weight. The 7% rule still exists, though, for things that are qualified as elastomeric content. But in any event, that's a big plus. Another change is there was something called the visible lining rule. Look at your clothes and you'll see that some things you have an outer shell and then you have a lining in it. And that visible lining created problems because to qualify under NAFTA, both the outer garment shell that would be determinative of classification and that visible lining had to both satisfy any applicable tariff shift requirements if they were not themselves originating. That problem has been dissipated because the visible lining rule has been eliminated under the USMCA. Also, if you have something put up in sets for retail sales, so you've got a pair of trousers and a belt that goes with it, you can imagine all kinds of things, a top and a bottom set. They may be different in their composition. USMCA is going to require that all the articles in the set be an originating good unless the value falls within that 10% de minimis level. One other thing that I think is going to be helpful for a lot of manufacturers, rayon fiber and rayon filament, other than a couple things, lyocell and acetate, can come from anywhere. So you got open season on rayon, you can use it in your products and off you go. And then I think a few other things. We've got some staged in requirements. These are new. Within 12 months, everything is going to have, at least if it uses a certain type of specified sewing thread, it's going to have to be formed and finished in a USMCA country. 18 months after the agreement enters into force, any article with a narrow elastic fabric will have to be formed and finished from yarn in a USMCA country. If it has a pocket bag, the trousers you may be wearing, that fabric for that pocket bag will have to be formed and finished from yarn that's wholly formed in a USMCA country. And then lastly, some items of just textile articles that are coated or laminated, that's going to have to be formed and finished in the USMCA country. So it's not, you're going to have, there's some twists, turns, and a lot of things that will have to be addressed to assure compliance. There are some exceptions, and let's just pick those up before we wrap this up. There is an exception for fibers and yarns and fabrics that are not commercially available in commercial quantities or in a timely manner. So think of Harris tweed, a Harris tweed jacket. That is something that falls within this exception as long as it's cut and sewn in a USMCA country. We have tariff preference levels. These are just specified levels of quantities of yarns, fabrics, apparel, and other articles that need to go through some significant processing in a USMCA country, but within those quantitative limits are going to be able to be imported duty-free. And then lastly, there's the Mexico special regime that has been around for a while. That will provide duty-free treatment for fabrics if the fabric used in the particular good was wholly formed in the United States, and if you also cut the components in the U.S. Ready for assembly, and nothing else happens in Mexico to advance the value other than just the assembly process and some post-assembly processes like bleaching, dyeing, that sort of thing. But otherwise, I think there are a lot of good things here, but it's also some complications that everyone's going to have to deal with and make sure that they comply. Dan, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Bruce. And don't go too far as we're going to quickly transition into an example getting us into the automotive industry. But just wanted to point out another area very quickly is, HS 85, Chapter 85 is a lot of electronic components. Many of you are using that. Just to give you an example of how USMCA is facilitating things, if you look at the old rules of origin for things around monitors and some electronics, for example, 852810, and there were about 9 other related parts. This gives you what that special rule of origin looked like in 852810. 852820 looked like this, and again, there were all types of variations on this theme. USMCA has just cut that down to this. It combined all of those into one straightforward rules of origin that made it flexible, because what the negotiators were looking at is what realistically this sector, the electronic sector, looks like in North America today. A lot of those are imported, low-value components coming in primarily into Mexico and being assembled there and then feeding into the North American supply chain. So I think as you go across the agreement, you'll see some of this simplification. The challenge is, and what's important to keep in mind, is if you look at something like 8537, which is when you start combining those components for that high-value manufacturing, that's where the rules of origin actually get tighter. And so I think as you're looking at, will this affect me? If you're moving in low-value components from overseas and doing assembly in North America, you're fine. But if you're bringing in components from overseas that are coming in as an advanced good, as an advanced manufactured good, that's where the challenges are going to be. So let me be more direct about it. If you are somebody that's bringing goods in from China right now, setting aside the whole issue of China tariffs, and then bringing those components into Mexico or Canada or the United States for that matter, it is highly likely that your rule of origin, or specific rule of origin under USMCA, is the same as NAFTA or tightened up. So those are the areas where you should be, particularly those of you that are bringing in product or know you have suppliers coming in from overseas of things that are already combined or assembled. You're going to need to take a hard look at those specific rules of origin, because as we talked about in episode 1, that was the target. Now, as we look forward, by the way, they're getting a lot of questions on to whether you'll get the slides. You will, within 24 hours, get a notice for on-demand viewing, and you'll have access to the PowerPoint presentation. Now, as we transition to the auto rules, Bruce is just going to give us an example of how these rules stitch together. Then we're going to turn it over to Eric Miller, and then, of course, to Sergio and Moises. So over to you, Bruce, for our final example before pouring into the automotive rules of origin.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Well, we'll do this really quickly, and we're going to take a hypothetical product that we're all familiar with. At least we were familiar with it when we used to drive our cars. It's the side view mirror in your vehicle. So it's the hypothetical example we've got is it's assembled in Mexico. We all know we see the plastic enclosure around it. We see the mirror on the front, but this particular item does not have the mirror on it. That's going to be attached when it's exported into the United States. There's a whole bunch of stuff underneath. There's clutches, gears, electrical wiring, all kinds of things. That's all Mexico content. But the two little motors, one that positions the mirror and the other one that retracts the mirror, are of Chinese origin. They're little motors, and those account for maybe, depending on how this product is structured, 5 to maybe 15% of the total value. Okay, so what's the rule of origin? We've got one non-originating item. It's these motors from China. The potential tariff classification of the finished assembly without the mirror. We're going to say it's in a basket provision for auto parts, 8708-2950. And that has actually been referenced by CBP in some of the rulings on this kind of a product. The motor is classified as an electric motor. It's 8501-1040 with a duty rate of 4.4%. What's the rule of origin? Well, if we assume that finished assembly is classified under 8708-2950, the current rule, and this is the rule under NAFTA, and this part of it is also applicable under the USMCA, a change to a subheading, to this particular subheading, 8708-29, from any other heading. That's the key. USMCA adds another requirement. If the part's going to be used in a passenger vehicle or a light truck, The regional value content is going to have to be 62.5% under net cost, 72.5% under the transaction value method. These both go up to 70 and 80% respectively after year 3. If we look back at our hypothetical, in our case, we've got 85 to 95% Mexican content, so we're good to go, right? It looks great. We're well over those content requirements. But there's another problem. CBP has held that side mirror assemblies like this that are classified under 8501, they are not 8708. Why do they say that? Well, when Customs looks at that, all that stuff behind the mirror, they say this is a composite good. It's got a lot of components. They perform a lot of different functions. And we have to find, therefore, the function that provides the principal function, or the item that provides the essential character for that good. And lo and behold, that item is the motors, even though they comprise only a very small percentage of the total content. Customs has pointed to a few and accurately points out to a few, terms in the tariff schedule that lead to that conclusion. But the bottom line is that mirror assembly is going to be classified under heading 8501. Well, what's the result? Well, the result is going to be that this assembly will not qualify as originating. The mirror assembly is in the same classification as the non-originating motors. The rule of origin requires that there be a shift to 8501 from some other heading, and that doesn't happen. And so that assembly is going to not qualify. It'll be subject to duty at 4.4% as a motor. Now, it's not just for this type of product. Customs has applied this same kind of 8501 motor analysis for products like windshield wiper assemblies that come up, again, without the wiper blades and arms attached. They've used it for electric actuators that are used in HVAC systems. Are there alternatives to avoid this? Well, we could look at the de minimis rule. I mean, in our hypothetical here, we've got a non-originating content of somewhere between 5 and 15%. The de minimis rule is 10%. We may or may not qualify there. The other option is we could attach an originating mirror in Mexico. That may not be practical. It's fragile. It could break. There could be a lot of reasons that you wouldn't want to do it. But then we would have a rule of origin under the mirror classification. Customs is going to determine that that product is a mirror under 700910. And in that case, the motors would go through the necessary tariff shift, and in that assembly with the mirror attached would qualify under USMCA. But there's one more problem. China Section 301 duties. Goods of Chinese origin, be it electric motors under 8501 or glass mirrors under 7009, are subject to a Section 301 duty of 25%. We talked a bit about the NAFTA marking rules and all that. Well, whether they apply or not, we'll see what Customs comes up with on that. For the purposes of Section 301, for the purposes of anti-dumping countervailing duties, the test is not the NAFTA marking rules for purposes of determining origin, but the general substantial transformation test that would apply broadly outside this agreement. So the courts have said that's defined to mean that if as a result of manufacturing or processing, a product loses its identity, it's transformed into a new product that has a new name, character, and use, then we can find a substantial transformation. But they've also said that we don't think that just raw assembly processes that don't cause those components to lose their separate identity qualify as a substantial transformation. So without that, we'd be facing the prospect that this product would be subject to China 301 duties. I don't have an answer to that question, but since I don't, I'm going to flip it back to Dan.
Great. Thanks, Bruce. I did promise we'd get over to the rules of origin by halftime. We're probably more about mid-third quarter right now. So we are going to work on the quick step, but for those of you watching the clock, I'm just mindful that we want to give full treatment to our speakers, so we are going to potentially run a little bit longer, but that's the beauty of on-demand in that vein, because we do want to get this information out there. But Bruce, I think, just laid out masterfully all of the factors that need to come into play, how you're looking at the general rules, the specific rules of origin, the changes, de minimis, and then, of course, we live in a world where there is more managed trade with China tariffs. And so this is maybe an opportunity to say, don't try this at home. As you prep for USMCA, it's more than just trying to find a new certificate of origin. This should be the time that you're preparing and looking at these things, not only the rules in the agreement, but the customs rulings associated with that, and potentially how tariffs and exemptions may come into application as well. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric Miller to kick us off with an opening, and then turn it over to Moises and Sergio. Again, I've asked our speakers to not rush through this. I'm mindful of where we are, but this is just this episode is critical to your preparation, so we're going to take the time that we need. And so with that, over to you, Eric.
Thanks very much, Dan. Great to be with you today. So I wanted to talk about the USMCA rules of origin, and I was asked at the beginning to talk a little bit about where this came from. Anyone who's looked at the auto rules of origin and has followed their evolution over the years are well aware that this is really among the most complex elements in our trading regime within North America. And so I'd like to say, and start at the beginning, is that rules of origin reflect the production structure and political preoccupations of their times. And when it comes to autos, which is really among the most valuable areas of our trade within North America, and is certainly the most integrated, rules of origin are incredibly complex because of the level of integration. I mean, even in Canada last year, there was $62 billion in auto trade within North America, and you take that across the other countries, it's crucial. And autos is where we began our integration process within North America in 1965 with the Canada-U.S. Auto Pact, and then in the modern era, starting in 1989 with the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. And out of that, there was a case, which was really a series of U.S. Customs rulings with respect to the issue of roll-up around Honda vehicles that were assembled in Ontario and what could be counted. Because the issue is that there's non-originating parts within motors that are counted. Now, the Detroit Three, who'd spent much of the 1980s fighting with the Japanese companies, pushed very hard to have those counted as non-originating. And this led to a great deal of conflict, not only within the industry, but also between the governments. And so you had what I call the Great Reaction in NAFTA, which is where you get massively specific rules of origin, you get the tracing list, you get uniform regulations, and a lot of complexity. And so this political preoccupation very much is still with us as we go into the USMCA context. And going into that, the negotiators really had three objectives. The first, given the context of the U.S.-China trade conflict and the desire of the Trump administration to push manufacturing into North America, was to increase the North American value content of vehicles qualifying as originating within North America, within the agreement. What you'd seen is the 62.5% value content, because of a number of the nuances in how the NAFTA rules were applied, often allowed vehicles to qualify that had content levels in the 50s, and USMCA set out to tighten up the rules, and so the final levels were put at 75% for passenger cars and light-duty vehicles. The second objective was to focus on the steel and aluminum components of those vehicles, because the auto industry are big buyers of steel and aluminum. This requirement that companies, in order to qualify, had to put 70%, had to purchase 70% of their steel and 70% of their aluminum within North America over a given year was introduced. And then the third piece, and we heard a lot from Democrats, especially during the negotiation, was to deal with the challenge that some in the U.S. saw with competing with Mexico on labor advantages. And so the U.S. proposal in the negotiation was very much focused on how do you put a minimum content level, and what was ultimately agreed was that you would have this labor value content regime. Now, Moises is going to go into core parts, principal parts, how you calculate labor value content specifically, and I'm happy to also offer some views on this. The auto industry really, though, I think it's fair to say, is not ready for July 1st. There is a great deal of concern about what will happen, and you heard Dan mention earlier that the interim guidance will not be finalized until July the 15th. The uniform regulations are still not ready for autos, and not surprisingly, in the negotiations among the three countries, this is the part that is the most far, I think, from a resolution. And there was a question that was put up yesterday with respect to supercore averaging and how that would work in the negotiation or in the application. And that's something that is still very much under negotiation. I reached out to a source yesterday who said, not finalized, we're not sure. The suggestion is that this will not likely apply across the three countries. It may apply across two countries, and certainly it can apply nationally, but there's no final answer on what will happen on that particular issue. But of course, governments are gearing up to prepare for the implementation process. CBP is setting up a new USMCA Center of Excellence. They will continue to have their specialized auto Center of Excellence in Detroit to deal with specific issues. But the trade is going to need a lot of support, and there's going to be a lot of questions that will arise. And in very much the auto industry will learn by doing how to actually apply these rules and practices, because there are an awful lot of unanswered questions at this point. So I'll turn it over to Moises to go into the granular details.
Great, Eric. Thanks for that perfect teeing up, and really over to you, Sergio and Moises, to take us through the details here on auto rules. So feel free to go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Dan. Eric, if we think about auto trade under the USMCA, we have to think on three elements. One is obviously the rule of origin, the new rule of origin for trading cars and auto parts. But also we have to think about a couple of insurance policies that the governments, members of the NAFTA, of the USMCA, were able to get from the U.S. And these insurance policies are related to threats that have been out there. One related to the potential or possible increase in tariffs, most favored nation tariffs for auto and auto parts. You've heard in the past months complaints in the U.S. that the tariffs that the U.S. imposes for imports of cars and auto parts are low, and that should be reviewed independently of the commitments that the U.S. has under the WTO. So the USMCA addressed these. And the other element that the USMCA addressed was a potential 232 measure against cars. So if we go into the following slide, let's start on what kind of insurance policy Mexico and Canada got in terms of potential increase of tariffs for cars imports into the U.S. Basically, the agreement is the following. Obviously, this will only apply to cars that do not comply and auto parts that do not comply with the rule of origin. Every car and auto part that complies with the rule of origin will be subject, under USMCA, will subject to duty-free treatment. So, but what happens if the U.S. increases NFM tariffs? Well, they will not apply to Mexican products as far as 1,600,000 units of cars and $108 billion in exports of auto parts. So if the U.S. increases tariffs in cars and auto parts, in the case of cars, the tariff for Mexico would stay on 2.5% duty up to 1.6 million cars. Again, this is in addition to cars that Mexico will be exporting, complying with the rule of origin, that will face no duty at all. And in the case of auto parts, it's $108 billion. There is a rule of origin to comply here, but as you can see in the slide, is a less strict rule of origin than the one that we have under the USMCA. So this is insurance policy against increasing import tariffs for car and auto part imports. There was another discussion, and that was the 232, and that is the next slide. There, we also got a different treatment, a special treatment, and basically for up to 2.66 million units of cars and up to $108 billion of auto parts, Mexico would be exempted from the 232 measure that the United States imposes on car and auto parts imports. The other element is obviously, and we're going now to the next slide, the rule of origin. And I will leave Moises, who is our expert and is working with ICOM in addressing these kind of issues with our clients, to go into the details. I will just make an introduction indicating that there are 4 key elements that we have to look at and that we will explain in the following minutes. One, obviously, is an increase in the regional value content requirement. This is the main change of the rule of origin of the USMCA. But there are also other very relevant changes. The other element, the second element, would be how the core parts for passenger vehicles and light trucks are now to be considered originating. A very controversial element, and that raised a lot of questions and a lot of confusion, was the labor value content. I mean, a lot of people at the beginning thought that there was a requirement under the USMCA for Mexico to increase wages. As you will see, this is not the case. Moises will get into the details on how we calculate this and what is exactly this labor value content. And the fourth main element to understand the rule of origin under the NAFTA is the purchases of steel and aluminum, the requirement that the member countries have in terms of how much steel and aluminum they buy within the region. Next, please. In terms of the regional value content, there is a transition period to get from 62.5% to 75%. We will start, now we know that the agreement will enter into force in July 1st. So we will start there on the transition period. It will go with an increase, a yearly increase, up to 75% by July 1st, 2023. The methodology, the elements to calculate this regional value content, keep some NAFTA methodologies and changing others. We are keeping the net cost methodology that we use under NAFTA. We're keeping the averaging also that we use under NAFTA, but tracing is out, deeming originating, the concept, this is out also. And but why don't I leave it here, Moises, and you get into the details and to the specifics on how we calculate the compliance with the rule of origin for cars and for auto parts.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sergio. Thank you for Dickinson Wright to invite me to be part of this seminar about NAFTA. Well, as Sergio mentioned, there is 4 elements that are established in the auto part rules of origin. One is related to the regional value content that Sergio explained already, how it will be increased every year until reach the 75%, the 3rd year of the entry into force of the agreement. The other element, it is related to the core parts. There are specific parts that should be originating under the NAFTA, under the USMCA, in order that the vehicle could qualify as originating. So there are 7 parts that must be originating. That is the engine, the transmission, the bodies and chassis, the axles, the suspension system, the steering system, and the advanced battery, that is basically the lithium batteries, that must be originating in order that the vehicle should be originated. These core parts should comply with 75% regional value content without having the specific provision of another methodology, such as the transaction value methodology or the change in tariff classification, except for the advanced battery, that they have an alternative rule of change in tariff classification. But the other 6 should comply with the regional value content under the NAFTA methodology. Secondly, the 3rd element related to the rules of origin, it is the purchases of steel and aluminum. So the producer of the vehicle must comply with a minimum of 70% of originating steel and aluminum purchases in order that the vehicle could be originating. The difference here is that the purchases of steel and aluminum are related to the corporate purchases of steel and aluminum. That means that a producer of a vehicle should put together all the purchases in the North American market in order to comply with these 70% of purchases on the steel and aluminum. That could be useful for the companies, because if a specific producer the steel purchases in one of the parties is 100% of the North American steel, that means that it could help to another plant that they have in another part of North America in order that they could comply with a lower percentage. And at the time that they put together all the purchases as a corporate, so they could have the possibility to reach the 70% of steel and aluminum purchases. According to the NAFTA, to the USMCA, there is some provisions that define that in the uniform regulation there will be the definition of steel and aluminum. However, because the uniform regulation are not ready in this moment, in the interims customs regulations that was published by the CBP on last month, there is a specific definition of steel that include the file-rolled products, include also tubes, pipes, and hollow profiles, but also include body stamping and chassis frames that is made from steel that could be considered as a steel product in order to and this body stamping and chassis frame should be purchases with originating goods in order that they could comply with the 70%. For the aluminum, the coverage is a little bit larger because it includes on-growth aluminum, also includes bars, rods, and profiles, plates, sheet and strips, tubes and pipes, and body stamping or chassis frames of aluminum. So all these materials that the producer of a vehicle purchases from any company, they should be considered in the total calculation of the purchases of originating goods. So the calculation will be very easy. It's just the sum of the total purchases of originating goods versus the total purchases of the vehicle producers in the corporation. So it doesn't matter where the steel of aluminum is purchased, they should be included in the total one in order to determine the 70% that is required in the rule of origin. The other one, it is related to the labor value content. That here in the LVC content applies in a different way to the manufacturers of passenger cars or the producer of light trucks, like pickups or vans. So the clause of LVC requires that the certain percentage of the vehicle should be manufactured with a minimum average weight of $16 per hour. So the LVC for cars is 4% with a transition period of 4 stages that at the entry into force of the agreement will be 30%, and in the following year will be 33%, and then 36%. And at the third year of the entry into force of the agreement will be 40%. So from July 1st, the car manufacturers should comply with a LVC of 30%. For the light trucks, it will be 45% without a transition period. So at the entry into force of the agreement, they should comply with this 45%. The LVC could be integrated with the sum of 4 different calculations. The first one is the high wage manufacturing cost. That it means that it is the workers that work in the manufacturing plant, and that they are directly involved in the production of the car. So that means any executive or any administrative worker could not be considered in the calculation of the wage manufacturing cost. Only the workers that are directly involved in the production of the car. The second element is the high wage materials and part costs that were produced with the minimum average weight of $16 per hour. And those materials are used by the producer in the manufacturing of the car. These part materials include parts that are used directly in the production of the vehicle, or to produce auto parts or materials that are used in the production of an intermediate materials or a self-produced part that is used in the production of the vehicle. That means that some auto part producers will help the vehicle producer to comply with this LVC, taking into account that some of the parts will be used for the calculation of the LVC. For example, if there is a Mexican producer that use material from the U.S. with a high wage, that is a minimum average wage of $16, and they sell this auto part to the car producer in Mexico. And this car producer use this material for an intermediate material or a self-produced part. So the cost of the high weight materials that are incorporated in that auto part could be considered to calculate the LVC for the general for the full car at the moment that it is finished and exported into the other parts. If the car producer achieves the LVC using these two elements, so there is no need for additional calculation. So they could have the 40% or the 45%, and it will be certified that the car is obtaining the LVC according to the agreement. But if this is not the case, the manufacturer can incorporate in the calculation other two elements of the LVC. So the third one is the high wage technology expenditure, that it is covering wages and salaries for research and development and information technology services. So this cost could contribute up to the 10% of the total wage cost required by the rule. And the other element is the high wage assembly expenditures. This element, in order to get this element, the car producer must demonstrate that they own or they have a long-term supply contract with an engine, transmission, or battery plant in North America that pay at least $16 per hour on average. But also there is another condition. These plants must have a minimum production capacity to manufacture originating goods. So for the engine and transmission plants, there should have a capacity of production of 1,100 units of originating goods. And for the advanced battery, it's 25,000 units to be originating in order that they could have this specific element that could grant until 5% points of the LVC. So in that way, if any car producer could have this specific element, they already have 5% points for the LVC. In that way, they only have to comply if it is a car producer only with, say, 5%, or if it is a pickup producer only with 40%. So that means that it is a flexibility in order to comply easily the LVC that is required by the rule. So in order to calculate the LVC, the producer should require basically sum all the material and manufacturing expenditures, and they could have an annual purchases value. So that means they could sum all the purchases during the past year or the current year, depending on the option of the producer, and then they would be as a percentage of the net cost of the vehicle or the total vehicle plan assembly annual purchases value. So there is an option for the producer if they get the net cost of the vehicle or the total vehicle plan assembly annual purchases value in order to determine the LVC percentage. And additionally, they have to sum the high wage technology expenditures of the highway assembly expenditures according to the option of the producer, and also depending if they require these additional two elements to get the LVC percentage according to the agreement. So in the case of heavy vehicles, basically it is the same requirements. The only difference, obviously, it is the regional value content, that instead of the 75%, it is 70%. and there is no core parts. That means that it is not necessary that the engine, transmission, body chassis, axle, suspension system, or steering system should be originating in order that the vehicle could be originating. Obviously, some of these parts requires to be originating, considering that it is necessary to obtain the 70% of the regional value cost. The steel and aluminum purchases is the same, the 70%, and the calculation it is similar. And the labor value content, it is 40% flat for all the heavy vehicles. And there are the 4 elements that are considered in the calculation with the same provisions that are established in the light vehicles. That means that it could be materials and manufacturing expenditures. And if the heavy vehicle producer could obtain the LBC for these 2 elements, that will be enough. If not, they could use the technology and assembly expenditures in order to determine the LBC percentage. So in this sense, the producer should require to have the administrative elements in order to determine if they require or not the research and development and information technology element and the assembly for the calculation of the LBC. In the case of the auto parts, so considering that the vehicles have a different percentage of regional value content, the auto parts also have a different percentage to be considered originated. This is important because if an auto part producer is a supplier for a light vehicle producer and a heavy vehicle producer, they should take into account these elements in order to determine if they comply with the rules of origin required for each one of the vehicles. So in the first step that any auto part producer should to be identified is where will be used the auto parts that will be sent to the manufacturer. If it will be for a heavy vehicle, for a light vehicle, or for other kind of vehicles, such as a special vehicle like an ambulance. And in that way, they have to check which is the percentage that this auto part should comply in order to be considered originated. Obviously, if the auto part comply with the more restricted rule that is the light vehicles rule for auto parts, automatically they comply with the other 2 rules of origin because it is not so much restrictive rule for that auto part. But in any way, they have to check if which is the final use of the auto part. And the second thing that they have to check is if the auto part is considered as a core part, as a principal part, or as a complementary part, taking into account that there are different requirements for each one of these parts. If it is a core part, it should be originating and should comply with the same percentage as the vehicle. If it is a principal part, they should comply with lower regional value content. So the principal parts will start with an RVZ of 62.5%, and at the end of the transition period will be 70%. And the complementary parts, it is also a lower RVZ that start in 72% and will finish in 65%. It is important to point out that if in the principal auto parts and in the complementary parts, currently there is an option to determine the origin of the good with the methodology of transaction value, they will maintain this option. So that means if there is a principal auto parts, instead of using the net cost methodology, they could use the transaction value methodology, and they need just only to increase this percentage in 10 percentage points. Instead of complying 62.5, you should comply with 72.5 under the transaction value methodology. But also, if in the principal parts or complementary parts, there is the option for a change in tariff classification, the USMCA will continue to allow to have this rule of origin. That means if the auto part comply with the change in tariff classification, it is not necessary to comply with the net cost or methodology or with the transaction value methodology. So it is just only the change in tariff classification enough in order to consider this auto part as an originating good. Obviously, if it is now in the rule, this option, they will continue to use it. If it is not in the rule for forging, this option to comply with the change in tariff classification, they need to comply with the only with the RBC considered in the rule. This is the same for the heavy vehicles. And for other vehicles, if there is an auto part that is for the other vehicles, the current rules of origin that is established in the NAFTA will apply in the USMCA. So instead of having 75 or 70 or 65%, it will be 50% of in the net cost method. So for the core parts, there are some flexibilities in order that the core parts could be considered originating. So these core parts establish that the producer of the vehicle could be considered the 7 parts as a single part in order to determine the origin of the 7 parts. So for that reason, it is the name of supercore. That means that the 7 parts could be put together and sum all the non-originating materials that were used to produce the 7 parts and made a calculation according to the formula of the net cost that is in the agreement. And in that way, they could calculate the regional value content of the core parts in order to determine the 75%. It doesn't matter if in a single way one is 100%, other one is 80%, and other one is 60%. At the moment that the producer put together all the parts, sum all the originating material, and sum all the non-originating materials, and in that way they made a calculation according to the formula. If the result is 75%, at that time the 7 parts could be considered originating, and in that way they could comply with this specific element. This is a provision that could help some vehicles producers consider that in some cases some of the core parts are not originating because there are some specific materials that are not from the region. But also, there is an additional flexibility that is established in the rules of origin. That the rules of origin determine that in a table A1, they define specifically the parts that are considered as a core parts, but also determine the main components or the key components that define each one of the core parts. So, for example, for the case of the steering system, the key components of the steering system is the steering column, the steering gears or the steering racks, and the control unit. So, in order to determine the origin of this specific core part, the producer of the core part will use the value of these key components in order to define the 75% percentage. And it doesn't matter the other elements that are included or the other materials that are included in the part in order to define the origin. If the value of these key components or maybe one or two of these components could determine the 75%, it would be enough in order that the core part could be considered original. So this is an additional flexibility in order to define the origin of the key parts of the core parts, and in that way, the possibility to define the origin of the good will be easy for the auto part producer and also for the vehicle producer. So in this sense, it is important that the auto part producer will check exactly if they not comply with the 75% in the regular methodology or in the regular process of calculation. They could use these supercore provisions in order to define if it is possible to comply with this specific rule. And if not, so they could check with the vehicle producer if it is possible that they could use the supercore provision to determine the origin of a good in a single way, considering the 7 parts as a single one. Other provision that could help to define the origin of the good, it is the de minimis rule. So as you know, the de minimis is a tolerance rule that excludes a minimum percentage of certain non-originated materials from the origin. In this moment, it is not possible to use, under the NAFTA, it is not possible to use this de minimis rule because of the tracing. That it is not possible to have the tracing rule because you need to take out the non-originating value at the moment that you report to the car producer. But under the USMCA, it is possible to use this de minimis rule to consider a good as originating. And it is important to know that in the current NAFTA, the de minimis rule, it is only related to the change in tariff classification rule. But under the USMCA, it is for the change in tariff classification rule and also for the regional value content rule. So in any case, you could use this criteria of the de minimis to determine the origin of a specific good. Previously, the other speaker already mentioned a specific example about how to use this de minimis rule. The next criteria that could assist to comply with the origin requirement is the fungible material or fungible goods rule that define that you could put together originating materials and non-originating materials, and you could use it in the production of a good, or you could commingle and export it in the same form, but taking into account that the company should have an inventory management methodology in order to define exactly which of these materials could be originating and which one could be non-originating, in order that define that the first goods that was exported will be considered originating until the amount of the materials that were purchased as originating. So this inventory management methodology could help the company to define exactly how much of these final goods could be considered originating under this fungible rule. The third one, it is also a criteria that could assist the auto parts producers to comply with the origin requirement. It is related to the intermediate material rule. So it is a material that is self-produced and used in the production of a good, but it is required that this material should be designated as an intermediate material by the producer. So it is important to know that this intermediate material could be used for the auto parts producers, but also for the vehicle producers. But if there is some exceptions, you cannot use the intermediate rule for engines or gearboxes. For these specific products, you need to comply the rule in a general weight, in a flat weight. It is not possible to use intermediate material. And in the appendix of the automotive rules, there is specific provisions about the components of the engines and the gearboxes that you cannot use for this intermediate material. So here in the slide, there is an example that it could be very illustrative. The first one, for example, if the final good is a shock absorber that use a rubber shock absorber dampers, and these shock absorber dampers perhaps could constitute the 20% or the 25% of the value of the shock absorber, it is important that these goods or these materials could be originating in order to that the producer of the shock absorber could get the 75%. However, these shock absorber dampers use non-originating rubber products that are classified in the same heading as the shock absorber damper. So in that way, it is not possible that they could comply with the specific rules of origin for these goods. However, if they define these control vibration rubber materials as an intermediate material, it could be comply with the specific rule of origin that is established for these absorber dampers. That is a change of subheading plus an RVC of 50%. At the moment that the producer of these shock absorber dampers define the rubber material as an intermediate materials, they could comply with the rules of origin of these specific materials and determine this as an originating. And then at the moment that they could sell this specific material to the producer of shock absorbers, at this moment the producer of the shock absorber could define these goods as originating and could help them to to reach the 75%. So this is important, that element that in this moment all the auto parts or vehicle producer will use in order to define or determine the origin of some of the goods, and in that way comply with the specific percentage that is required in the rule. The third element that it is currently in the NAFTA is the indirect materials. So all the materials that are used in the production, testing, or inspection of a good, but are not incorporated directly to the final good, will be considered as originating, and it doesn't matter where is the country of origin of this specific material. They could consider it as originated at the moment that they calculate the RVZ under the net cost methodology or under the transaction value methodology. So this is something that is currently in the NAFTA, and it is currently used or could be used in the calculation of it. So the second provision that is related to the average for the car producers or for the auto part producers will continue to use the averaging rule that is currently in the NAFTA. So for the car producer will be considered this averaging under the fiscal year of the producer, and there are three options, a specific option that they could use to define the averaging calculation. It could be the same model in the same class of vehicles, it could be the same class of motor vehicles, producer in the same plant, or it could be the same model line or the same class of motor vehicles. Meanwhile, in the case of the auto parts producer, it could be considered different options for the averaging calculation related to the fiscal year, to the quarter or month production, or over the calendar year, to the fiscal year of the producer, or the fiscal year of the producer to whom the good is sold, depending. And there are some specific requirements that they need to follow in order to determine the average. But this is something that the companies already use, considering that are the same provision that is currently in the NAFTA. And also, for the calculation of the LDC, there is the possibility to use the averaging rule. And it is similar to the one that is related to the average for the car production. So in this way, they could use the same option that is used for calculating the average of the car, in order that they could have the same average element that could help to determine the LDC percentage in a specific car. But also, in order to define this averaging, or in order to determine the LBC, the car producer could use a specific periods of time. It could be the previous fiscal year, the previous calendar year, or it could be use the LBC according to the quarter or month to date in which the vehicle is producer or exporter, or the producer fiscal year to date in which the vehicle is producer or exporter, or the calendar year to date in which the vehicle is producer or exported. That will be an option that it could be defined with for the car manufacturer, which could be the best period and the best average element that they could use at the moment that they calculate the LBC. For the steel and aluminum, also the producer may calculate the purchases in a similar way that the periods that are in the LBC over the previous fiscal year, the previous calendar year, or a quarter or a month, or for the producer fiscal year to the date in which the vehicle is exported, or over a calendar year to the date that the vehicle is exported. So according to the calculation formula, the purchases should include the direct purchases, the purchases to a services center, or the purchases of a contracted through a supplier. But these three elements that I mentioned are the ones that are established in the USMCA. However, in the interim rules that was published by the CBP, it was included another kind of purchases. Is the purchases for major stamping that form the body in white or the chassis frame of the vehicle. That means that the purchases of these specific products should be considered in order to determine the 70% of the purchases of steel of aluminum. And then
Moises, 1 minute. It's just Dan Yuto. I did want to jump in here because it's amazing. You are answering people's questions almost as they're asking them. So right when I'm about to interrupt and ask a question, your next comment usually is answering them. It's fairly amazing. We do have a few questions that I want to park to the end, but I am mindful of the time. We still have a few hundred people with us right now, mostly from the auto sector. No surprise there. So we're going to be, I just want to let everybody know we're going to be wrapping up here in just a few minutes. There's just a few minutes left. We'll take these final questions. So if you do have a specific question, now's the time to ask. But I am mindful for those folks that need to jump off or whatever. Again, it's on demand. But just wanted to give everybody a heads up, get your questions in. But most of these questions have been answered already, Moises. It's really amazing how it's flowing. But I'll turn it back over to you as now you've had a chance to catch your breath as well. But for those of you kind of clock watching, there's a few more minutes. We'll take some questions just to get them on the record and close it out and move on to the next. So thanks again, Moises, and I'll turn it back over to you.
For example, one of the questions is related to the engine testing costs we use for the high wage LBC calculation. The answer is no, because it is only high wage related to the production of the material. The engine testing it is not related to the manufacturing cost of the good. So in that way, it is not a work that is related to the specific manufacturing process that are in the provision of the rules. Well, the greases that are included in a principal part or in a core part, if it could be considered that as indirect material if they are used, if they comply with the definition, the specific definition related to the indirect material. So it could be considered an indirect materials because it is used in the production of the good, but at the same time is related to the or the operation of this specific good. So it could be considered as an indirect material in the case of the for the calculation of the RBC. So I don't know if there are additional questions about it.
No, that's great. I'm sorry.